Michael took considerably longer to come around to a similar place. He has always been, throughout his entire life, the more cautious and risk-averse of my two children. It wasn't until he and his wife finally came to visit me, nearly 7 full months after I had originally moved, that something inside him genuinely seemed to settle and soften. I remember picking both of them up from the airport that day, carefully watching his face as we drove through streets he had clearly, privately imagined very differently beforehand. He kept commenting, almost involuntarily, on how safe the neighborhood actually felt in person, on how many local people greeted me warmly by name, at the small market, at the neighborhood pharmacy, at the little corner cafe where I reliably had my coffee most mornings of the week. On his very last night there before flying home, we sat together quietly on my small balcony. The exact same balcony where I had once stood alone, genuinely wondering if I had made a terrible mistake in coming here at all. He was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. Then he said, "Mom, I think I was scared that if you had this much money and this much freedom all at once, you simply wouldn't need us anymore." I told him gently that needing him and needing his formal permission for my own decisions were two entirely different things, that I would always need my children in every meaningful sense that mattered. I would simply never again need anyone's approval to live my own remaining life exactly as I saw fit. He nodded slowly, thoughtfully, taking that in. And for the very first time since this whole difficult ordeal had begun months earlier, he actually offered a genuine apology. Not for worrying about me in the first place, which I could always understand and even appreciate, but specifically for that awful word his sister had used so carelessly, exploitation, applied directly to his own mother's careful, deliberate, thoroughly considered choice. I want to say something honestly here because I genuinely believe it matters. I don't believe my children were villains in any part of this story, not for a single moment. I think they were simply frightened, in a way that is entirely human and understandable. I think grief, when it isn't ever fully processed or properly worked through, has a strange, unpredictable way of quietly resurfacing years later, disguised as something else entirely. Disguised as concern, disguised as caution, disguised sometimes as an urgent need for control over a situation that actually has nothing to do with them. I think losing their father unexpectedly and then watching their own mother make such a dramatic, unfamiliar choice not long afterward quietly reopened a wound that none of us, myself included, had ever properly dealt with in the years between. That understanding, of course, doesn't fully excuse the specific accusations that were made along the way. It simply helps explain where they were genuinely coming from, underneath all the anger and fear. It has now been a little over a year since I sold that house back in Denver, since I stood in my own kitchen, listening to my son casually refer to my entire life savings as an inheritance he was somehow already owed. My life here today looks absolutely nothing like what either of my children originally privately feared it would. I am not sitting lonely in some sad, isolated apartment, being quietly taken advantage of by strangers, exactly as those anxious articles Susan once sent me warned might happen. I have built a small, steady, genuine community around myself instead. I have Maritis downstairs who reliably checks in on me if she doesn't happen to see me for a day or two in a row. I have my regular Wednesday book club, my Saturday cooking class, where my adobo, I am proud to finally report, has become genuinely, reliably good. I video call my grandchildren every single Sunday, without fail, watching them grow up in real time, even from thousands of miles away. I have visited home twice over this past year, and each visit has felt noticeably warmer than the last. Each visit has felt a little less like a quiet interrogation, and a little more like simply, comfortably seeing my own mother again, exactly as it should be between a parent and her grown children. I still have almost all of my original savings fully intact, carefully managed and monitored. I live comfortably here, but I certainly don't live extravagantly by any measure. I built the emergency fund I had promised myself I would build. I built the dedicated long-term care fund. I built the modest cushion for life's inevitable, unexpected expenses, exactly as I had promised both my children and myself that I fully intended to do from the very beginning of this whole process. I also formally set up a proper, legally sound estate plan, working directly with a qualified attorney, not out of any lingering guilt over the earlier conflict, but simply because it was the responsible, sensible thing for me to do at this stage of my life, regardless. My children now know exactly what will eventually happen to whatever remains, someday, whenever that particular day finally comes for me. But that specific plan exists entirely on my own terms, thoughtfully written by me, for reasons that I personally chose. It was never extracted from me through fear, pressure, or family conflict of any kind. Sometimes people I meet here ask me, quite naturally, whether I regret how the entire situation unfolded, the heated accusations, the long stretches of painful silence, that terrible word, exploitation, sitting there coldly in a text message sent by my own daughter. I honestly don't regret any of it anymore, not really. I think every family, at some genuine point along the way, has to relearn exactly who its individual members actually are, underneath the familiar roles everyone has settled into over the years. My children had to slowly learn that their mother wasn't simply a fixed, permanent fixture from their own childhood home, frozen in time exactly where they had left her. She was, and honestly always had been, a whole, complete person, with her own unfinished story still very much being written. I, in turn, had to learn that loving my children completely didn't require surrendering every single decision about the rest of my own remaining life for their personal comfort or peace of mind. If you had told me 3 years ago, sitting alone in that quiet house back in Denver, eating cereal standing over the kitchen sink night after night, that I would eventually end up exactly here, on a small balcony in the Philippines, with a genuinely good cup of coffee in hand, a real community that actually knows my name, and a family relationship that had to fracture slightly before it could ever properly heal in an honest way, I don't think I would have believed a single word of it. But here I am, 73 years old now, still actively learning, still occasionally a little afraid on certain quiet mornings, but no longer simply existing, day after identical day. Actually, genuinely living again. And for the first time in a very long while, that particular feeling is more than enough for me. If there is one single thing I would tell any woman standing exactly where I once stood, staring quietly at a large number sitting in a bank account, wondering privately if she has the right to spend the rest of her remaining life exactly the way she personally wants to, it would be this: you earned that number. Every single year, every quiet sacrifice, every long, unremarkable Sunday afternoon that slowly built it up over decades of steady effort. It belongs entirely to you, and to no one else. And absolutely no one, not even the people you love the very most in this world, gets an automatic vote in how you ultimately choose to live out the years you have remaining. I think about Robert often, out here on this balcony, especially in the quiet early mornings before the street below fully wakes up. I wonder sometimes what he would make of all of this, of the little apartment, of Marita's and her stories, of my terrible early attempts at adobo, of the entire long, difficult conversation with our children about money and trust and independence. I like to believe he would understand completely. He was never a man who tried to control me during our 42 years together, and I don't think he would have wanted our children to start now simply because he was no longer here to remind them of that. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes only with age, one that nobody adequately prepares you for in advance. It isn't the freedom of youth, reckless and untested. It is a quieter, harder-won freedom, built directly on top of decades of responsibility finally fully discharged. I raised my children. I supported my husband through good years and difficult ones. I taught thousands of students how to read a paragraph closely, how to find the argument buried inside a sentence. I paid off a mortgage. I showed up faithfully for nearly everyone in my life who ever needed me to show up for them for the better part of 5 full decades. And when it finally came time to ask what I wanted for myself, Purely and simply, I discovered that I still remembered exactly how to answer that question, even after all those years of quietly setting it aside for other people's needs instead. That, more than the money, more than the balcony, more than the warm evenings and the friendly greetings at the local market, is what I would genuinely want my own children and anyone else listening to this story to eventually understand. Growing older does not mean quietly disappearing. It does not mean slowly handing over the keys to your own remaining life simply because the people who love you are frightened of losing you sooner than expected. It means, if you are fortunate enough, exactly what it has come to mean for me. A second unexpected chapter, written entirely in your own voice, on your own terms, for the very first time in as long as you can honestly remember. Some evenings, when the heat finally breaks and the street below quiets down just a little, I sit out on that small balcony with a cup of tea and simply watch the ordinary life of the neighborhood unfold in front of me. Someone grilling fish a few doors down, children chasing each other between parked motorcycles, an old man walking his dog slowly past the same corner store at exactly the same time every single evening, as though his life still runs on a schedule he trusts completely. I used to think a life like that, small and repetitive on the surface, would feel unbearably confining to me. Instead, I have found it to be the opposite. There is a kind of peace in choosing your own repetition, rather than simply enduring one that was handed to you by circumstance. I think, too, about the version of myself who almost didn't get on that plane. The version who nearly let her son's phone call and her daughter's careful lawyer language talk her out of the one decision that ultimately gave her life its shape back. I am grateful, more than I can easily put into words, that I didn't let fear make that particular choice on my behalf. Not their fear and not my own. My son and daughter and I still disagree about plenty of small things, the way any family does. We argue over which airline has the better route for their visits, over whether I should finally learn to video call without holding the phone 6 inches from my face, over whether my adobo recipe truly needs quite so much vinegar. But we no longer argue about whether I have the right to be here, living this particular life, in this particular way. That argument, the one that once threatened to break something important between us, is finally fully settled, and I intend to keep it that way for as long as I possibly can. When the money from the sale of my house finally hit my account, the balance read $538,000. I sat there staring at those numbers for several minutes, unable to fully absorb what I was looking at. It was the result of 40 years of work, of saving, of quiet sacrifices nobody outside my own kitchen ever saw. That morning, I felt free for the first time since my husband died. 3 days later, my oldest son called and asked me, almost casually, exactly how much I had gotten for the house. It wasn't a question out of simple curiosity. Looking back now, I can say with complete certainty that it was the beginning of the biggest fight our family had ever had. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and comment where you're watching from. My name is Helen Carter. I am 72 years old, and for 31 years I taught high school English in Denver, Colorado, in the same building, to thousands of teenagers who I like to think left my classroom slightly better readers and occasionally slightly better people. I had 2 children, Michael and Susan, both grown now, both with families of their own, both scattered far from the house where they were raised. And for 8 years, I had been a widow. My husband, Robert, died of a sudden heart attack in the driveway of the house we had lived in for 34 years. He was fixing a gutter, of all things, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in October. I remember the paramedics telling me later that it probably happened instantly, that he likely didn't suffer. I don't know if that was true, or if paramedics simply say that to every widow they find standing in a driveway in her nightgown. Either way, I chose to believe it, because on some mornings that single sentence was the only thing that let me get out of bed at all. After Robert died, the house felt enormous in a way it never had before. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard he had spent 20 summers slowly turning into something beautiful. All of it built, piece by piece, for a family of 4. And now it was occupied by exactly one person, who mostly ate cereal standing over the kitchen sink because cooking a full meal for herself felt like an unnecessary kind of sadness. There is a particular loneliness in setting a single plate at a table built for 6. Nobody warns you about that part of grief. Nobody tells you that it isn't the funeral or even the first anniversary that breaks you. It's the small domestic moments repeated endlessly that eventually wear you down. For the first 2 years, my children called constantly. Michael from Seattle, Susan from Austin. They took turns flying in for holidays, sending flowers on the anniversary of Robert's death, checking in with a kind of vigilance that, at the time, felt like love, because it was love. They were, by every reasonable measure, good children. But life, as it always does, kept moving forward without asking anyone's permission. Michael's boys started travel soccer, with tournaments that ate entire weekends. Susan's daughter started filling out college applications, with all the anxiety and paperwork that comes with it. The phone calls went from daily to weekly, and eventually to whenever someone happened to remember. I don't say any of this with bitterness. I raised my children to build their own full lives, independent of mine. I simply hadn't fully understood, until I was living it, what it would actually feel like once they succeeded at exactly what I had taught them to do. Around my 70th birthday, I started noticing something uncomfortable about myself. I was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. Not physically tired, but tired of the sameness of everything. The same grocery store, the same 3 restaurants I rotated between out of habit rather than pleasure, the same news anchors delivering the same kind of bad news every single evening at exactly 6 o'clock. The same empty side of the bed, cold every night for 8 straight years. I had spent my entire adult life taking care of other people's schedules. My students' schedules, my husband's schedule, my children's schedules. And for the first time in decades, there was nothing left on my own calendar at all. Just white space, week after week, stretching out in front of me with no clear purpose attached to it. One night, unable to sleep, I was scrolling absently on my tablet when I came across a video of a woman about my age, sitting comfortably on a balcony, somewhere warm. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she paid less for her entire month of living than I paid just for property taxes back in Denver. I watched the whole video, then I watched another. Then, embarrassingly, I watched 12 more before the sun came up. The woman in most of those videos wasn't selling some unrealistic fantasy. She was simply showing ordinary mornings, a trip to the local wet market, a plate of fresh mangoes, a long conversation with a neighbor on a covered porch. Somehow that ordinariness was more seductive to me than any luxury resort could ever have been. I wasn't looking for paradise. I was looking for a life that still had texture to it. I want to be honest about something important here. I did not wake up one morning and suddenly decide to become an adventurous woman in her 70s, chasing some grand reinvention. I was frightened of almost everything about the idea. Flying alone across an ocean, being far away from doctors I had trusted for decades, being far away from my grandchildren's birthdays and school plays and all the small milestones I had never once missed. But I was more frightened of something else entirely. I was frightened that if I didn't do something drastic, the next 10 years would look exactly like the last 2 had. Quiet, comfortable, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, disappearing.
So I started doing what I had always done as a teacher facing a difficult problem. I made lists. I compared cost of living figures late into the night. I researched visas, healthcare systems, safety records, expat communities, everything I could get my hands on. I watched people who genuinely loved living abroad, and I watched people who had moved back home disappointed, trying to understand exactly why. I wanted the whole picture, not just the polished, curated parts that show up first in a search engine. The number that kept surfacing, again and again, throughout all of this research, was the value of my house. I finally had a real estate agent give me an honest professional estimate, and when the figure came back, I actually laughed out loud, standing alone in my own kitchen. The market in Denver had changed so dramatically since Robert and I first bought that house back in 1989 that the property alone was now worth more than either of us had earned in our entire individual careers combined. That was the exact moment the idea stopped being a distant fantasy in my head and started being a concrete, actionable plan on paper. I want to pause here and explain something about the difference between a decision made out of anger and a decision made out of genuine clarity. This was not me running away from my children. This was not me trying to punish anyone for growing distant or for living their own busy lives. I loved my family fiercely. I still do, without question. But I had also spent 40 consecutive years putting everyone else's needs consistently ahead of my own, and I was finally asking myself a question I had never once seriously asked in my entire adult life. What do I actually want for myself, independent of anyone else's approval? It took me nearly 8 full months to prepare properly. I did not rush a single part of it. I met with a financial advisor 3 separate times, going over every possible scenario. I met with an elder law attorney to understand exactly what selling the house would mean for my taxes, my Medicare coverage, and my long-term financial planning. I specifically researched the Philippines for several practical reasons. English is widely spoken there, which mattered enormously to me at 71 years old. The cost of living was remarkably low compared to Colorado, and the culture, from everything I read and watched, placed enormous, genuine respect on older people. That last detail mattered to me far more than I initially expected it to.
I told my children about the plan roughly 6 months before I actually moved. I did it over a phone call, which in hindsight was probably a mistake. Some conversations simply deserve to happen in person, face to face, where a person can see your eyes and understand your intentions, rather than filling in the silence with their own worst assumptions. Susan's first reaction was silence. The particular kind of silence people use when they are very carefully choosing their next words. Then she asked me, gently but pointedly, if I was feeling depressed. If perhaps I should talk to someone professional before making such a large decision. I understood completely why she asked that. Grief does strange, unpredictable things to families over time. And from the outside, a 72-year-old widow selling her family home and moving across the entire world can genuinely look like a crisis unfolding, rather than a carefully considered choice. Michael's reaction was different, more practical, more direct, more immediately focused on logistics. He asked about the money first, how much I thought the house would ultimately sell for, what my projected monthly budget would look like once I was settled, whether I had seriously considered what would happen if I got sick while living overseas, far from familiar hospitals and familiar doctors. They weren't unreasonable questions, taken individually. I had already asked myself every single one of them, multiple times during those 8 months of preparation. I answered as honestly and thoroughly as I possibly could. I told them about the health insurance policy I had researched extensively. I told them about the retirement visa program I qualified for under the country's rules for foreign retirees. I told them about the emergency fund I intended to keep entirely separate from my regular daily spending. I thought, rather foolishly in hindsight, that once I demonstrated exactly how much careful thought I had put into every piece of this decision, they would finally relax and trust me. They did not relax. Over the following months, the phone calls became less about how I was actually doing, and increasingly about whether I had changed my mind yet. Susan started sending me articles about scams, specifically targeting elderly Americans living abroad. Michael sent me a detailed spreadsheet, entirely unprompted, projecting healthcare costs if I simply stayed in Denver instead. I appreciated the underlying concern, genuinely. I did not appreciate the quiet assumption sitting underneath all of it, the assumption that I was no longer fully capable of making sound decisions about my own remaining life. The house sold faster than I ever expected it would. 11 days on the market, 3 separate offers on the table. I accepted the highest one, from a young couple expecting their very first child together. There was something quietly fitting about that detail. A brand new family starting out in the exact house where I had raised mine decades earlier, with all the same hopes they surely carried now. Closing day itself felt strange, almost dreamlike. I walked through every single room one final time. I stood in the kitchen where Robert and I had shared roughly 10,000 ordinary breakfasts together over the years. I sat briefly on the back steps, where I used to grade stacks of student papers on quiet Sunday afternoons while he mowed the lawn nearby. I cried, not out of regret for the decision itself, but because closing a chapter, even a chapter you are genuinely ready to close, still deserves to be properly grieved, at least a little. 3 days after that money finally landed in my account is precisely when Michael called with his question about exactly how much I had received for the house. I told him the number directly. I had absolutely nothing to hide from him. There was a pause on the line, noticeably longer than the question itself should have required. Then he said something that has stayed lodged in my memory ever since. He said, "Mom, that's basically our inheritance. You're about to take our inheritance to another country." I honestly did not know what to say in that moment. I still, to this day, remember exactly where I was standing in my own kitchen when he said it. I remember the particular way the late afternoon light was falling through the window above the sink, because I found myself staring blankly at nothing in particular, trying desperately to figure out how to respond to a sentence that had genuinely knocked the air out of me. I want to be completely clear about something important here. I never once told my children that house was somehow being preserved specifically for them. Robert and I had always said throughout our entire marriage that our retirement savings and whatever equity built up in the house were meant for us, for our own old age. Whatever happened to be left over afterward, whatever we ourselves didn't ultimately need, would naturally go to them someday as a final gift. But the house itself was never framed as a formal promise to anyone. It was our home first, and only later did it become, technically, a financial asset. And I was the one who had earned the right, through 40 years of my own labor and sacrifice, to decide exactly what happened to that particular asset. Still, hearing my own son casually refer to it as their inheritance, as though I had already died and he was simply patiently waiting on the paperwork to be finalized, hurt in a way I had genuinely not prepared myself for, despite months of anticipating some level of pushback. Susan called the following evening. She tried a noticeably gentler approach than her brother had. She talked about family, about staying close to one's roots, about how their father surely would have wanted the money to remain close to the family, geographically and otherwise. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage under the circumstances, how exactly she knew what her father would have wanted, given that he had been gone for 8 full years and had never once, across 42 years of marriage, tried to control what I personally did with money I had directly earned through my own career. That particular question did not go over well at all. Over the following 2 weeks, the phone calls multiplied rapidly, almost aggressively. Michael suggested I put the entire sum into a formal trust, with himself named as the trustee, purely for my own protection, he insisted. Susan suggested alternatively that I simply move in with her family instead, so that someone, in her exact words, could keep an eye on things going forward. I understood, underneath all of this pressure, that they were genuinely frightened. They had already lost their father unexpectedly, and now their mother was doing something that felt, to both of them, disturbingly like losing me as well, in a slower, more voluntary way. But understanding the source of their fear did not make it acceptable for either of them to treat my own life savings as something that somehow required their formal permission before I could use it as I saw fit. The family group chat, which for years had mostly consisted of recipes and photos of grandchildren, transformed into something else entirely during this period. Michael wrote a long, carefully organized message listing every single reason he could think of that moving abroad alone was reckless and irresponsible at my age. Susan wrote that she had spoken to a lawyer friend of hers about something called elder financial exploitation and wanted to understand my legal rights and theirs going forward. I sat there reading that particular phrase over and over, exploitation, applied directly to my own careful, deliberate, thoroughly researched decision, made with my own money, after 8 full months of methodical planning. And I felt something shift inside me that had genuinely never shifted before, in 72 years of living. I had spent my entire life being Helen, the reasonable one, the endlessly patient one, the mother who quietly absorbed everyone else's worry and dutifully turned it into calm reassurance for them. But that particular night, I sat down and typed out a message that I deleted and rewrote 3 separate times before finally sending it. I told them both as plainly and directly as I possibly could that I loved them completely, that I understood their underlying fear and did not hold it against them personally, and that the decision itself was already made, fully and finally. I told them the house was sold, the flight was already booked, and that I would no longer be discussing my personal finances as though they were some kind of formal family committee I needed to answer to for approval. I did not sleep well at all that particular night. I kept anxiously waiting for my phone to explode with angry replies. Instead, there was only silence, the specific kind of heavy family silence that somehow feels far louder than any shouted argument ever could. 3 weeks later, I boarded a flight to Manila, carrying 2 full suitcases and a small carry-on bag containing every important document I owned. My passport, my recent bank statements, copies of my Social Security paperwork, and a single photograph of Robert, taken on our honeymoon back in 1979, young and sunburned and impossibly happy. I chose to settle in a small city just outside Greater Manila, close enough to reliable hospitals and the international airport for genuine peace of mind, yet far enough away to avoid the heaviest traffic and constant noise of the capital itself. I rented a modest 1-bedroom apartment with simple tile floors, basic furniture, and a small balcony overlooking a busy street where tricycles passed by constantly, honking cheerfully at absolutely nothing in particular, all day long. The first week, there was thoroughly disorienting. Everything around me felt unfamiliar all at once. The thick humidity, the unfamiliar language drifting past me in the street, even the particular quality of the sunlight at 5 o'clock in the evening, so different from Colorado's dry mountain light. I remember standing on that small balcony during my second night there, genuinely wondering if I had just made the single biggest mistake of my entire life. I called absolutely no one that night. I did not want anyone back home to hear that doubt in my voice and use it later as proof that they had somehow been right about me all along. But something unexpected happened over the following weeks that I genuinely had not anticipated. A neighbor, a warm woman named Marie-Thérèse, who ran a small convenience store on the ground floor of my building, started greeting me every single morning without fail. At first it was simple, polite courtesy. Then it slowly became genuine, sustained conversation. She asked thoughtful questions about my life back home. She told me openly about her own grown children, 2 of whom worked overseas and faithfully sent money back to her every single month. Exactly the way families there so often function. She said something to me one particular afternoon that I have thought about many, many times since. She said that in the Philippines, family takes care of its older members, and that this responsibility is never seen as a burden, but rather as a genuine honor, something people actively want to do, not something they grudgingly tolerate. I told her, somewhat hesitantly at first, about the entire fight with my own children back home, about the word inheritance, about the proposed trust, about that terrible word, exploitation. She looked at me for a long, thoughtful moment, and finally said something simple but profound. She said that money is not the same thing as love, but that sometimes people confuse the two without even realizing they are doing it. That single sentence sat with me for days afterward, turning over quietly in my mind. I slowly began to understand something about my own children's reaction that I had not fully considered before, despite everything. Their fear, I came to believe, wasn't really about the money itself at its core. It was about control, about the deeply unsettling realization that their own mother was a complete, independent person, with her own private desires entirely separate from simply being their mother, and that this person was fully capable of making significant life choices they themselves had never approved of in advance. That particular realization, I think, is genuinely harder for many adult children to accept gracefully than most people ever openly admit. Meanwhile, my own daily life slowly began to take real shape around me. I found a small, friendly, English-speaking book club that met every Wednesday afternoon at a cozy cafe run by a retired Australian couple. I found a skilled physical therapist for the persistent arthritis in my knees, who charged a small fraction of what I used to pay back in Denver, and who somehow spent twice as much unhurried time with each patient during every single visit. I started taking a hands-on Filipino cooking class every Saturday morning. My adobo was, by any honest measure, genuinely terrible for the first 2 full months. But my patient instructor, a kind man named Danilo, absolutely refused to let me give up on it, no matter how many batches I ruined. Slowly, month after month, my actual monthly expenses became crystal clear on paper. Rent, utilities, groceries, health care, local transportation, and my periodic visa renewal costs. I was living comfortably, genuinely comfortably, on less than a third of what I used to routinely spend back in Denver. The meaningful difference wasn't simply disappearing into some vault somewhere, untouched. It was steadily going into a modest, but very real financial cushion. An emergency fund, a dedicated long-term care fund, something I had honestly never managed to build so solidly or so quickly at any point during my entire working life. About 4 months into this new life, Susan finally called again. Her voice sounded noticeably different this time. Quieter, less rehearsed, less defensive than before. She asked how I was actually doing, not how the money itself was doing, but how I was doing as a person. I told her the complete truth, that some days were genuinely difficult out there, far from everything familiar, that I missed her and Michael and all my grandchildren terribly, in a way that would sometimes ambush me completely at strange, unexpected hours of the day or night, but that I was, for the first time in a full 8 years, genuinely curious again about what tomorrow might bring, instead of simply enduring it as something to be gotten through. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. Then she said something I genuinely had not expected to hear. She said that she and Michael had talked things over privately, and that after finally speaking with an actual qualified estate attorney, rather than relying on a well-meaning friend's second-hand opinions, they had learned that everything I had done throughout this entire process was completely, unambiguously within my legal rights. That there had never actually been any real legal issue at all. That they had simply been afraid and scared people, she admitted openly, sometimes reach instinctively for the language of protection when what they are actually feeling underneath it all is a kind of raw helplessness they don't quite know how to name. I appreciated that particular moment of honesty far more than I would have appreciated any simple apology. An apology can often be about smoothing an uncomfortable situation over quickly. That kind of honest, difficult self-reflection is about actually understanding what happened and why,